Build your own empire, send out expeditions around the globe, and dominate opponents by diplomacy, trade, or warfare. Not quite Rome has fallen and the world is up for grabs, but you have my curiosity. Today's installment is something a bit different. We'll be taking a look at another new release empire builder on Xbox, Anno 1800. This is still an Age of Empires 2 channel, so I'll be comparing Anno to Age throughout the review, and we'll get back into purely Age of Empires content next week. Anno 1800 is Ubisoft's latest take on a console RTS, and it's actually really good, but can it hold a candle to the greatest real-time strategy game of all time? In this video, I'll share my initial impressions, review, and compare Anno to Age of Empires 2. Ooh, that's a sick menu animation. Okay, let's nerd out over these settings real quick before jumping in. Inverted Y? Check. Look at all those settings. Dead zones, bunch of camera sliders, separate access controls, even custom keybinds. Brings a tear to my eye, man. But the camera is a bit stuttery, and the textures don't load as fast as you can move, even on Series X. I spent a bit of time trying to dial my sensitivities in, and even with all those controls, wasn't able to get the acceleration feeling just perfect. Literally unplayable, 0 out of 10, review over. Just kidding. These settings are great, and the camera control really does feel fluid in-game. My only real beef is that I want to be able to zoom out further, especially when the ship panel is taking up half the screen. Alright, who are we going to play as? Games never have a character option that looks anything like me. I guess this dude's kind of cool, let's go with him. Man, I hate naming characters too, but the random generator in Anno has some fire options. So I've never played this series before. I'm going to go with some easy settings. Less guidance though, as I hate tutorial pop-ups, and this is my second attempt. I played around a bit before deciding I liked the game enough to make a video about it. So you have to do this little tutorial first, where you attack fish with some dynamite. And that's like the whole thing though. After the cinematic, you're dropped right into city builder mode. While the more guidance setting is helpful, I was still learning largely from trial and error, even with it enabled. How does Anno compare to AoE? Age of Empires 2's 4 ages span about 1,000 years, starting after the fall of Rome and advancing through roughly the 16th century by the late game. Anno 1800 is, as you might have guessed, set just a few hundred years later. Playing the campaign, your new empire emerges not from the fall of Rome this time, but in the wake of your father's death. A familiar start, the world is shrouded in the fog of war as you begin the game with a central building that will serve as the keystone of your economy. Unlike Age of Empires, once the fog is cleared, you keep visibility on explored areas even when none of your units are around, so you can always see what other players are up to. Anno's marketplace, while possibly an allusion to the town center, doesn't really have any significant gameplay mechanic. It's just a prerequisite building. Some of your population needs access to it, but once it's built, you basically ignore it. The church also satisfies a need for your residents, and doesn't train monks. Wolo no. An aspect that is very similar, your primary control UI are wheel menus on the triggers, one of which has contextual commands like the site menu. An additional flavor I'd not previously encountered in this type of game, there's RPG-esque elements like dialogue choices that can affect your outcomes and side quests where you earn items that give you a stat buff. In contrast to researching the next age, your buildings can level up once their needs are met. Upgrading does similarly advance your game by unlocking new population tiers, buildings, and units, but you can't upgrade the entire empire all at once, and shouldn't try to. Your initial farmers are still required even after unlocking new population tiers, and making big changes to your eco-balance can be problematic. The city building experience in Anno is awesome. The game looks beautiful and has some really great quality of life features. The building mechanics are so satisfying. You can do all sorts of clever translations, like moving or upgrading a selected group of buildings together, automatically building a road around something, or planning out future areas in blueprint mode before you have the resources for construction. You can, for example, grab an entire portion of your city and plop down a copy somewhere else, which is super useful for propagating a grid pattern as you expand. Copies can be rotated too, but the roads unfortunately will only generate at 90-degree angles. It would have been dope to make tessellating geometric patterns or create some kind of radial symmetry with this tool. I am kind of curious though what it would be like if we had this tool in Age of Empires 2. Imagine if you could do this with, say, a mill and your farms. It could make for an interesting balance between manual and auto eco, as some players might prefer this kind of mechanic over the full automation of villager priorities. It would help give controller players a chance to keep up with keyboard and mouse while still requiring a manual action that takes some skill and game knowledge. What do you think? Would it be too drastic if Age of Empires 2 had a copy tool like this for console players? Your farmers will begin to populate your new settlement once you've given them somewhere to live. As your population grows, you can start collecting resources and manufacturing goods. This is done with a production lines mechanic. If you've played City Skylines, this will feel familiar. If you're new to city builders, the gist is that you collect a raw material, process it into some intermediate goods, and then use those to produce a final product. Those products are needed to an extent to keep your population happy, but can also be traded to other players. Like Age, different resources collect at different rates, which can be affected by upgrades or bonuses. But in Anno, you have to manage several separate production chains simultaneously, and if you fail to balance the production times of the different buildings in your chain, your economy can fall into bankruptcy very quickly. It's a whole lot more involved than knowing you need 7 gold miners and 6 farmers to make knights. In Anno, if you want to make gunboats, for example, you'll need an iron mine, 2 charcoal kilns, 2 furnaces, 6 weapons factories, a sheep farm, a sailmaker, a lumberjack's hut, and a sawmill, along with all the associated population to fill those jobs and necessary production to keep your residents happy. Something that took me a while to figure out is that you can use passive trade to buffer your economy if you don't have the resources or population to create the perfect ratios in your production chain. The factors that go into efficiency and profitability in this game are complex. This is where Anno has a ton of depth. If you're the type of nerd that likes to make min-max spreadsheets, this is the game for you. If you prefer to play more by feel, managing your economy can be a bit frustrating. The tutorial guidance doesn't really explain all the details, and relatively subtle changes can quickly wreck your economy. Your population's kind of got a hair trigger, and they're ready to stop paying taxes and riot at a moment's notice. They will, however, put on a parade in your honor if you do keep them happy. Something that tripped me up is how precisely you need to keep your production in balance with your population, having enough workers to fill jobs and enough goods to keep them happy. If there's too much of one or the other, things fall apart quickly and can cascade into an economic death spiral before you realize what's going on. This is a moving target, as upgrades and items can unexpectedly cause these kind of problems despite appearing as a benefit to the player. And as much as I love the copy tool, I got into trouble being greedy with it. A sudden influx of new residents can deplete all your supplies, tanking happiness and wrecking your eco. The game does provide a lot of information to help you with this, but the menus are a bit cumbersome to navigate with a controller, and there's so much to digest that it makes for quite the steep learning curve. For contrast, City Skylines has similar mechanics, but your industrial and commercial buildings will automatically trade with other towns when they have problems, like too many goods or not enough raw materials. Anno does have a similar feature called passive trade that I learned how to use only after starting over twice because I was so far in the red. Cities is just a less complex game overall, so its info views are simple and easy to understand at a glance. While an imbalance there can build up to a problem if you ignore it long enough, there are warning icons and a lot of time will pass before you start seeing abandoned buildings and a red balance sheet. In Anno, I found myself struggling to stay profitable while learning the game, especially once you reach the point where you need to start expanding your empire to new islands. If you're running into trouble at this point like I was, around the time when your workers start to want beer, try setting your trading post to sell any goods you're overproducing. Age would fall somewhere between the two as far as how punishing these sort of mistakes can be. While it can happen that you're alerted to an economic imbalance by 20 enemy knights suddenly GGing you out of nowhere, that's not likely to happen when both players are of similar skill. The trade routes menu is daunting to get started with as a new player. If you thought figuring out LT plus X was hard for setting up trade carts in AoE, woohoo man! So in Anno, you can trade between your own islands and with others where you have trade rights. There's a green icon on the world map indicating which parties you can trade with. That actually confused me at first because I didn't realize you could trade with yourself, as your own islands don't get the icon. Anyway, it's pretty simple to set up a basic trade route. You just select which goods to load and unload on each island. But there are a lot of options. You can customize which ships go where, carry what, and what order the route goes in, how much of each good to transfer at each stop, even setting conditional behaviors like a minimum stock to maintain on each island, or what your ships should do if there's not room to load or unload. Outside of the routes menu, you can also assign your warships to escort trade vessels, and you can manually load up a ship with goods and take it somewhere to sell. Trade's most obvious function is to balance your economy. You can sell things you have too much of and buy what you need more of. But different islands can offer different prices, so arbitrage is possible, kind of like in No Man's Sky. Despite the abundance of informative menu pages to sift through, there doesn't seem to be a consolidated profit and loss report for trade, at least not one that I could find, so it's hard to know how much money you're making, or if you're even turning a profit. You'll engage not just in trade, but diplomacy and battle with other islands. Unfortunately, there's only naval combat, and it's just okay. There's familiar RTS controls like attack stance, control groups, and patrol, but a limited gamut of combat units, and they don't interact with each other in a hugely interesting way, at least at the start of the game. Basically, there's gunboats, frigates, which are just bigger gunboats, and ship of the line, which is, you guessed it, an even bigger gunboat. New classes of ships do unlock later in the game, and even more are available as DLC, But according to Ubisoft, the PC version's DLC and season passes are not planned for release on console. So in the early game, for console players, all ships pretty much do the same thing. There are significant stat differences like speed, damage, and fire rate, but the combat mechanics overall aren't super engaging for me, especially after immediately falling in love with the city building side. Probably the most interesting aspect of ship-to-ship combat in Anno 1800 is that different ships fire at different angles and turn at different speeds, so there's some opportunity to micro by engaging your enemy from their weak side. Similarly, there's wind. Ships headed into the wind maneuver more slowly, so you can outplay your opponent by keeping your navy working with the wind. You can besiege the enemy harbor as well, but mounted guns have a huge range and do a lot of damage, so be prepared to lose some ships. For the Pirate Cove, it's probably a more profitable strategy to just camp outside the range of their defenses and intercept ships as they attempt to come and go. Anno 1800 is very much a city builder first and an RTS second. Not saying that's a bad thing, and it does seem like a pretty difficult balance to strike as far as gameplay design, because while there's surely other players like me who want more combat mechanics, I did find a number of other reviews where city builder fans weren't happy with how much the RTS aspects can distract you from just peacefully crafting your utopia. Anno's gameplay design really does nail the dopamine trip. The pacing of world events, progression, and level ups is spot on to keep you playing just a little bit longer until suddenly hours have passed. Philosophically, I'm not so sure that's actually a good thing, but at least they don't shy away from acknowledging the addictive nature of the game in the form of humorous, bi-hourly notifications reminding you to take a break.
How about a cup of coffee?
Overall, Anno 1800 is an incredibly captivating experience, and a game that I'll likely spend many more hours playing. How do you feel about the console version of Anno 1800? Got any suggestions for console RTS games I should try out? Thanks for watching. See you next week.